So the final strand in Rosenshine's principles that we look at in the training is the process from guiding student practice, obtaining a high success rate, and moving to independent practice. And I really like this aspect of Rosenshine's principles because practice is something which I think is an undervalued, understated aspect of learning. We don't really get good at anything without practice. Practice has lots of different forms, but it's that there's a level of kind of repetition and consolidation which I think is understated typically. And this is where the 80% kicks in. Most of a lesson should really be building fluency and confidence with knowledge you already have, rather than constantly feeling like you're struggling and so on. And that's something which isn't always the case with lessons. You see a lot of children in a lot of lessons where they're doing things that they really find difficult and they're not practicing things that they can do, building confidence. So this links to other ideas related to mindset, and without getting too bogged down in this, I do think it's important to reference it. So I often use this idea of a coach with an athlete, in this case throwing a javelin. How would you get the javelin thrower to improve? Well, you wouldn't just urge them to, not give up and things like that. That wouldn't really be very useful. You wouldn't just urge them to try harder either, because if a student tries hard and still doesn't succeed, they can end up feeling that there's much point making an effort, or they can think, well, I really am bad at this, aren't I? Because I've tried hard and I'm still no good at it. Those sorts of things that aren't very helpful. What you would do with an athlete is that you would identify something specific to practice and get them to focus on practicing that thing. And if that wasn't working, you might try something else. And your whole language with them would be about identifying the thing to practice which will help them unlock success. So it might be, in this case, the run-up, the throw, the strength of the throw, the angle, the fluidity of the motion, whatever it is. And you just said, just work on that bit. Just practice that. Don't worry about the rest. Just practice that. And it's about identifying a practicable part of the whole routine which will unlock success. And if a student applies effort to a strategy which then, in this case, sees them get the javelin inching slightly further forward, then they're going to start thinking, hey, maybe I'm okay with this. Maybe making effort pays off. And then they invest in that process and they see that there's a payoff from making effort. So linking effort to strategy is the basic bedrock of how engineering a growth mindset is meant to work. And this is why, I've explored this in one of my blog posts, comparing the studies around implementation of mindset thinking to metacognition. And the studies seem to suggest that thinking about metacognitive strategies is more likely to work in a school context because, in my opinion, it's because partly it's related more closely to the specifics of the curriculum than mindsets tend to be, which tend to be a few steps away and can be lost in the genericism of whole school assemblies and messaging of that kind. And actually, it could be that metacognition is as a way of engineering the mindsets which you need to succeed. And I like this language of engineering success. We set ambitious goals for all our students. We're not saying anyone has lower goals than anyone else. We're just saying we're all aiming here, but we've got steps along the way, and each of those steps has to be achievable. If the next step in your journey seems impossible, well, the entire journey is a write-off. The next step has got to seem manageable, even if the journey to the top seems a long way. So what are the simple steps that we can take, which we can guide students through and get them to feel confident with a high success rate? Well, a good analogy there is about sport. Most sports, like football, have a complexity at the whole task level. But to get good at football, you practice individual skills and drills. You do the trap and pass, you do tackling, you do headers, you do certain moves over and over again, repeatedly, mixing them up, combining them in different ways, small match scenarios, one-on-ones, two-on-two. And of course, then you do play the whole match again. You can't get better at football if you never play a match, of course. But learning is a bit like that. You practice at various different levels, always really with a focus on building confidence and adding challenge at the right point. So here's another scenario is the fact that some teachers have this very real experience and they find this difficult. There are some students who are ready to fly. They don't need you to tell them the basics. They don't want a heavily guided instruction because they've got enough secure knowledge in order to kind of go off and really sort of see what they can do independently. At the same time, some other students really are not remotely close to that and need you to guide them step by step on nearly everything just to succeed at the very most basic level. So we need to be aware of this, that within a situation in lessons, we have some students where we need to consolidate, embed, and others where we need to allow them to go off. And managing a lesson to move from guided practice to independent practice at slightly different rates with a mixed class is one of the great challenges of teaching. But that's kind of what you need to be thinking. Always be thinking, who do I need to guide more closely in here, and who's ready to go off on their own? Because if you get it wrong either way, you can make mistakes. So if you give too much guided instruction and guided practice to students who don't need the guidance anymore, it can have a negative effect. It can start making them feel sort of hampered, disengaged. And you're also partly making them maybe rely on you too much. They need to practice independently because they're ready to. Conversely, students who are sort of off in the deep end, off you go guys, and they're not ready for that feeling, can just flounder horribly and start masking the whole culture in the classes. You're supposed to be able to do this now, and they can't. Well, in a lot of lessons, it's very, very difficult for a student who's not confident to admit to that and to raise a hand and say, hey, I really don't know what to do. So being aware at both ends is key, and a really effective teacher will get that right and hit the sweet spot. Now, Rosenshine said this very explicitly. So less effective teachers can get it wrong either way. They can not provide enough guided practice to begin with, or not give enough opportunities for independent practice. So it's pretty challenging to get this right, I think, and we need to know our students very well and in terms of their success rate and confidence within the subject. But let's have a look at the sort of things you can practice. So things like use of language. You don't get good at using words in your speech or in your writing unless you practice them. And my feeling is that often students are given too many words to practice sometimes, and therefore don't practice any of them with much repetition, and so they don't use them, and that can be a problem. So imagine what it would take for a student to start talking about the wicked witch with her gnarled fingers and bulbous eyes. Now they might read that in a story, and they might understand the words, but then to volunteer them as part of their writing would be a whole other step. Her gnarled fingers and bulbous eyes. They'd have to practice that quite a lot. Her gnarled fingers, gnarled, saying it, using it, being one of your own words. My son had this experience with his writing at primary school. They often talk about this, where he started a great many of his stories. There was a grey, monotonous sky. And we used to laugh about it, like, oh, if we use that again, he'd say, well, why not? There's almost no story you can't tell that doesn't begin, there was a grey, monotonous sky. And he used to do that because it set him up. He felt good about the writing. He thought, I'm a writer, I can do writing, I can tell a story. And it felt like a good platform. And that's what a lot of writing is. It's slightly fake at some level, and then the authenticity emerges through maturity and fluency. But it doesn't start at that point. You don't begin as a fluent creative writer. You start with tentative steps where you're kind of borrowing and using things slightly artificially. That's natural. Things like using fronted adverbials in your writing. You don't, analysing them as a structure is one thing, but to fluently deploy all of a sudden or quick as a flash requires a level of practice. And I think sometimes the practice aspect doesn't have enough repetitiveness in it, and that can be problematic. So I really think it's useful if people can think about this practice aspect very, very thoroughly. What are you practicing and at what point are you going to get the students to generate this frequency of use. And it could be, let's all write an all of a sudden sentence. Let's write another one. Let's write another one. And then we discuss all of our all of a sudden sentences, and we all practice loads of them. And it's through the practice that they become, that the automaticity arises. The same is true of number bonds. So number bonds to 100. You might know them, you might be able to work them out, but knowing them fluently comes through a high level of repetition and frequency. And I've seen them done this superbly well in primary and secondary, where these are what you might call workouts. They are everyday workouts that you do repeatedly. Number bonds, doubling and halving, dividing by 10, divided by 100, times it by 10 and 100, factors, multiples. If this sort of pretty foundational maths knowledge is repeatedly encountered and practiced, it becomes fluent and you recall it quickly, and that's what your working memory is then freed up to apply that knowledge. It can be useful to think of knowledge as, in maths, a sort of tiered practice. So it's not about setting lower expectations. It's just about recognising where the students are, and therefore what is the most appropriate thing for them to then practice. So in maths, you might have section B questions and section C questions, as shown here. Section C, their questions are harder, and you can't really do section C unless you can do section B. Now, some students just need more practice at section B level before they go on to do section C. Later on, you might mix them up, so you have to apply them. You might make it slightly harder by doing them, sometime later after you initially taught them, so that there's a difficulty that is induced through, removing the recency. You haven't just taught it; you have to remember the whole method from before. So knowing when to practice and what to practice is a part of your repertoire as a teacher. And I think if you just flip from one thing to another, I've seen question sets in maths and other subjects where they ramp up too quickly, so the students aren't getting enough practice within a level before they move on, and so they're not really practicing. Practicing things like French, there's a strong move away from long lists of words and verb paradigms. So students learning practicable phrases which are in chunks at a phrase level, so we can all learn to say, j'aime bien aller au cinéma avec mes amis, and we all know what that means. I love going to the movies with my friends. We all know what that means. J'aime bien aller au cinéma avec mes amis. And knowing that that's what you say and it's accurate is really, really helpful. So the students know how to say that fluently with confidence. It's right, it's correct. They can later develop that to say, we love going to the swimming pool on a Saturday, or next week we're going to enjoy going to the cinema, or whatever. The development comes from a platform of secure knowledge that you already have. And too often students in languages are insecure about nearly every element, and then they're being asked to combine it, and so they have a combination of lots of insecure elements rather than stuff they know is correct, which they then develop. And it's much better to have a slightly shallower, a narrower range of things you just really know than a wide range of knowledge you just simply don't have the fluency with, and it's not really your own knowledge. It's just the stuff it's like a list of stuff I don't know rather than a list of stuff I do know. I often tell the story of my son revising his French GCSE, where he did pretty well, and one of the things he did was verbally rehearse quite a complex structure like où que j'aille, quoi que je fasse, which means wherever I go, whatever I do. Où que j'aille, quoi que je fasse. And these are irregular structures. This is the subjunctive, and you could get bogged down in trying to understand the application of the subjunctive, where and when, and the whole technical aspect of it. But it's actually really helpful to just be able to say où que j'aille, quoi que je fasse whenever you want to, because you know that is what it says, where it's applicable through practice. So practice is the key there. The kind of rationalisation of the structure is secondary to that, because once you know où que j'aille, quoi que je fasse, and you can say it fluently, we can now have an interesting discussion about why it's different and retrospectively apply that knowledge. And so that to me is key. The guided practice, the repetition, is a precursor to the deeper understanding. And it's true of lots of the structures that we might teach, as I mentioned earlier, when we're scaffolding. So when we're talking about throughout the poem, at first glance, but both, however, whereas these sorts of structures, they start off as a slightly false scaffold. The scaffold then comes down, and through practice and repetition, the students learn to vary their writing, deploying these with a level of confidence and appropriateness through practice. And again, not too many, but practicing the ones that you do know. And as we got fluent with certain, we mix it up a bit. We add other structures. Maybe try this, maybe try that. And of course, you need to wean students off very rigid writing frames. But there's no harm in starting with those for students who are really finding it difficult to even open a paragraph. I think we can practice explaining things. I think this is one of the great understated features of teaching, that you don't get good at anything without a bit of practice, but that also applies to explaining. So for example, what are the advantages and disadvantages of a wind farm? Well, I could ask you to do that now. No, you might give a reasonable answer, but I might say, okay, well, let's just evaluate. Did you include all of these? Did you talk about farmers? Did you talk about bird kill? All right, so let's have another go. Explain it again. Let's see if you can do a better explanation. Practice it again. And evaluate, and then let's just rehearse that one more time. Let's see if we can really get a good one now. Let's give the fullest, most fluent answer you could give to that question. And why don't we do that more? I mean, you could explain almost anything that there is to explain to do with literature or maths or science or history or French or music. Can you explain it again better? And that second round, where teachers do get students to repeat explanations, the second level is always better. And that's what they're going to remember more when they have to record it in the future. And it just takes a short loop of feedback and practice for students to improve their initial answers and get better at them. So fluency of explanation, I think, is undervalued and needs to be looked at. Can I explain how the motor works? The motor that I always bang on about. Well, yes, you can really get better at that. You can get better at practicing using the equation. You can get better at remembering the equation. You can get better at explaining how the equation explains the behaviour of the motor. You can practice applying it to different scenarios. And I found it really useful to look at a question like this, like a hard question. Here's a hard physics GCSE question, and to deconstruct it in terms of all the things which the students might practice. So in this particular example, moments, like, can they explain it? Can they remember what it is and explain it? That's practicable. Can they use the equation force times distance for moments? Well, yes. And can they practice that? Yes, they can. Can they use standard form? Because the numbers in the question are 4.8 times 10 to the minus 4 Newton meters. Can they practice using standard form? Yes, they can. Can you practice giving the definition of magnetic flux density and remember its units? Yes, you can. Can you practice using the equation F equals BIL in different permutations and rearrangements? Yes. And can you practice using two different equations, linking them up and rearranging them? Well, yes, you can. So all of the things which are difficult about that question can be improved by practice. So you have to engineer practice opportunities which have a level of repetition around a certain set of ideas. And that's what independent practice looks like, is when the students are knowing the things that they need to practice themselves and are repeatedly engaging with them. So a school where my wife works, they have this great idea for revision, where they go through this process where levels of practice to help students revise. They call it face it. So facts, you start, can I just remember the basic ideas as the first level of practice? Because if you can't remember the basic facts, it's really hard to do the other things. So simply like knowledge recall, that kind of thing. That's step one. Step two is, can you practice questions based on that knowledge where you're not sure, it's new questions, but it's still limited to applying the knowledge within a topic. That's the mainstay of good exam practice. Can I practice just applying the knowledge that I've already know, but it's just in a new situation? The next level is the slightly harder questions where you have knowledge from different aspects of the curriculum and bringing them together. So this is where you get to the higher end questions. And finally, once you've practiced all the things, can you do them in timed conditions? And This is one of the perversities of our system, where we have students end up doing timed practice of a whole exam in the hall, in the mock exam, when they've never really even done the practice of the simple recall at the beginning to the level of intensity they could. It's just a wasted opportunity. There's no point waiting to the exam to test your knowledge of simple recall. That should all have been done in advance. So the timed practice, that level of real fluency and stamina of writing for an hour, is something which you build up, but it's certainly not where you begin. And if you do it too early, the students are just not remotely prepared. So staging up the practice, going from the simple workouts, building up stamina, adding levels of depth and complexity is part of your whole moving through this routine of practice that Rosenshine describes. So I think that really is the final thing in Rosenshine's principles. Thinking about practice and then moving from guided practice to independent practice, hitting that high success rate, which means you've got to be prepared to make things slightly easier if students are struggling too much, or make it slightly more demanding if the success rate is getting much higher than 80%. Asking lots of questions, checking for understanding, and making sure that students are regularly reviewing the material, either as a sort of activation of prior knowledge to start a lesson, or revisiting things they've done in the past. And all of this depends on that first one, sequencing, concepts and modelling. If your curriculum is well set up, then the rest of it all is easier to do. So that is where I suggest people begin. Now, as people will know in my training, I like to make this very important thing. But here we go. It's not a checklist. And I have to say this because I'm partly responsible probably for some schools taking these ideas and turning them into a checklist. And it's something which I say in my book about it. I'm saying it now. There is no sense in which Rosenshine's principles 1 to 10 can be and should be enacted in any given lesson to any level of frequency. That's not the point of them. They are principles of what effective instruction typically will have in it. But that has a rhythm and a dynamic which is very context dependent. It depends where the students are, what they did last time. And it could be that they need more exposition, more explanatory input at a certain point, more just heads down practice another time. Some lessons could be well used just doing questioning and nothing else, because that's where you're at. And all of that is very subject specific. Where there's a checklist of any value, it's to a teacher, have I thought about all 10 principles or all 4 strands? Have I thought about them in my practice? I'm almost certainly doing them all, but how well am I doing them? How intensively do I get students to practice and repeat things? How consistent am I with that cold calling strategy or checking for understanding? Am I involving all the students in checking all of the knowledge? It's about getting into the corners and being precise about the gaps and finding out where they are. And also remembering that there are other things that we do in teaching, like we do get students to generate ideas and to be creative and make products and stand up and teach bits of lessons themselves, all those sorts of things. There are other things that are going on, other modes of instructional, of teaching, which are not just about teacher-led instruction. So it's about whether I'm synthesizing all of those things into one cohesive whole of a really good practice. So I really want to end by stressing that. I hope that people find the Rosenshine's principles useful as a prompt, and will continue to refine their practice as they go along. Just a couple of things to finish on. I really think it's helpful to refer back to the model quite often. Why is it the students find learning difficult? Well, why is it an attention thing? Is it because they're not actively connecting the knowledge to what they already know? Is it an insufficient amount of generative retrieval, which is explores the whole of the schema? Are we getting a bit deluded about task completion, so we finished it but actually nothing was really connecting to prior knowledge, so they just forgot it because they just did it there and then and didn't really learn it? So that model can explain a lot of the reasons why students don't learn things. And similarly, therefore, I think we should be doing this in our training, checking. Do we all agree with this? Do we all agree on the definitions of things? And continually to work together to have shared understanding at a school or team level, so we're always talking about the same ideas. So thank you very much for listening to these presentations. I hope you find them useful. You can obviously share them with each other, stop and pause and go back, and good luck with putting them into practice in your classroom.